stood and stared at it, marveled at its beauty, its genius. Billions of people just living out their lives, oblivious.
Did you know that the first Matrix was designed to be a perfect human world where none suffered, where everyone would be happy? It was a disaster. No one would accept the program. Entire crops were lost. Some believed that we lacked the programming language to describe your perfect world, but I believe that as a species, human beings define their reality through misery and suffering. So the perfect world was a dream that your primitive cerebrum kept trying to wake up from. Which is why the Matrix was redesigned to this, the peak of your civilization. When I say your civilization.
Okay, first question is, who's seen The Matrix? Okay. So, for those of you that haven't, the guy in the glasses is Agent Smith. Then the guy, in handcuffs, that is Morpheus. But The Matrix was, you're going to simplify this, it was a computer program. And the whole idea was it was a computer program that was fed into the human mind to convince them that they were living, even though they were actually they were stored in individual little containers. I know, I'm not going to explain the whole thing. Watch the movie. But what it really was is The Matrix, for lack of a better word, it was virtual reality on super steroids, okay? Convinced them that it was real. But the one thing that I really want you to kind of take from that is the one thing when he talked about, that the first Matrix was designed as a perfect world, but the mind kept rejecting it. And he said that he'd come to the conclusion that human beings define their reality by misery and suffering. And you may wonder what that has to do with anything, because then you're looking up here and you're like, we're talking about heaven today. And you're like, well, that makes no sense whatsoever. Stick with me, because I think that it will. Because I think the fact is that so many times, heaven is one of these. We've been going through the how-to series, and it's how to love my church. And the whole concept of this series has been different ways that God has told us in his scriptures to love his church, okay, the church of Jesus. And so what we have learned is that we love his church through a variety of different ways. We love it through baptism. We've talked about loving it through communion. We have talked about loving it through scripture, loving it through unity, which comes from the use of our gifts. And today, what we're coming to is how to love the church of Jesus by knowing, by embracing, and by living in the reality of heaven. And the reason that I say, I use this clip is because I think in a lot of ways, we have a hard time with the concept of heaven. It boggles the mind. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? And I want to give you something here. This is kind of a theme that I want you to keep. We're going to catch up to it at the end. But on the back of your bulletin, on the sermon notes, it says this, and it's something to keep in mind. When we see the world from a heavenly perspective, we make it a better place to live. But when we view heaven from a worldly perspective, we make it less than what it is. Okay? The reason I say that is because none of us have ever been to heaven. And so we have to use our imagination. In fact, Alistair McGrath wrote a book, and it's called A Brief History of Heaven. And I want to read you something that he said, because I think this fits in so well to what we're talking about. He says, when Marco Polo returned to Italy from the court of Kublai Khan, he described a world his audience had never seen, one that could not be understood without the eyes of imagination. Not that China was an imaginary realm, but it was very different from Italy. Yet as two locations on planet Earth inhabited by human beings, they had much in common. The reference points of Italy allowed a basis for understanding China, and the differences could be spelled out from there. The fact is that we need reference points when we're talking about heaven. And I think that in many ways, it's left up to the imagination, and a lot of times we get confused about it. It's the reason that I think there's a lot of people that have different views of heaven, that they have different visions of what heaven is like and how it's going to come about. We have all of these different discussions. The fact is, Jesus, he spoke about hell, but he talked about heaven as well. In the Old Testament, the New Testament, heaven is spoken of and is referenced to. And so it's something that we shouldn't just gloss over, that we shouldn't just go, oh, okay, well, yeah, whatever. Because embracing it and understanding it and knowing the reality of it should make a difference in the way that we live today. It does. And I know we like to, well, no, I thought heaven's just about what we get afterwards. No, here's the deal. We need to be asking these questions not so much about heaven as the great by and by, but what heaven has to do with the not so incredible here and now. And the fact is that living in the shadow of heaven, embracing the concept of heaven, should change the way that we live day in and day out. And so what I want us to do is kind of go back here, and we're going to take some reference points, talk through them. We're going to answer a few questions. We're going to talk about what heaven is like. We're going to answer the question of what is in heaven. We're going to answer the question of what is not in heaven. And then we're going to answer that big question of, what impact should heaven have on us today? What importance is it to us today? Now, you guys know we've talked about this before. In the Bible, we see a framework, and the timeline of the Bible is Genesis chapters 1 and 2 give us perfection created to the glory of God. Okay? Then from Genesis 3 verse 1 through Revelation 20:15, we have the unfolding drama of redemption for the glory of God. Revelation 21 and 22 are perfection renewed to the glory of God. And the reason I tell you this is because in that, we kind of get this timeline and we get some reference points as we look and try to envision and imagine a place that nobody living has ever been before, which is heaven. And what we find is that not only when we see perfection renewed to the glory of God, we know that we can gain reference points to heaven in the things that we can see, taste, touch, and feel today. Also what we can look back and experience in history, but also what we can experience in history from the context of Genesis 1 and 2, which is perfection created to the glory of God. And so as we run through our questions here, we're going to start off first and foremost, what is heaven like? One of the things that I want you to understand is, number one, heaven is not some place we go to, okay? Secondly, it is not the spiritual, non-physical realm that I think a lot of us grew up believing or envisioning or maybe were even taught, okay? The fact is that heaven is a real place. And so what we're going to do is actually go here. We're going to be in Revelation 21. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, Revelation chapter 21, we're going to do some reading here. This is our key verse, is what we're going to be going through. Revelation 21 verses 1 through 3 are our key verse. We're going to read a little bit more. We're going to kind of look at this and dig in to find out what heaven is like. So if you want to read along with me, Revelation 21, starting verse 1, this is a vision that was received by the Apostle John. He had been exiled on the island of Patmos, and in that point he receives this vision, which is all of Revelation. Now, at this point in verse 21, we are coming to the end of this revelation. And so this is what he writes. He says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" Now, one of the first things that we learn is what? We learn that the new Jerusalem that he talks about coming down from heaven is going to come down to, out of the new heaven onto the new earth. And it is a real physical place. I do want to say this. If you were ever raised, or if you've been around anyone who is Jehovah's Witness. See, Jehovah's Witness believe that 144,000 are going to go to heaven, but that everybody else that's good enough is going to experience paradise on earth, heaven on earth. That is not what John is talking about, okay? That's not the case that he's separating the two. What he is talking about is that the new Jerusalem, there will be a new heaven, a new earth, and the new Jerusalem will come down from heaven to earth. And so what John's saying is that heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem are what? They're a physical place. Heaven is a physical place. It is a real place. It is not this spiritual, that we it's not the Matrix. It's real. Okay? But there's something that's really kind of interesting here because as I was reading this, this angel is there with him. And as you read along, and I would challenge you, go back and read this because all of it is really cool, but we're going to kind of talk about some points here. But the angel that appears is walking along with John, and he has with him a measuring rod. And with it, he is measuring the new Jerusalem. And here's the implication. We go back to this point of reference points, okay? That's the reason I say this is because why do you measure it if it's just some mystical, spiritual place? See, you don't. And it's a reminder, once again, that heaven will be a real, physical, eternal place, okay? But I love the measurements that in Revelation 21:16, the city's described as a perfect cube. He says, "The city was laid out like a square, as long as it is wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length, and as wide and high as it is long." 12,000 stadia, I want to give you that, is basically 1,500 miles. The new Jerusalem is 1,500 miles that way, and that way. Now, I want to give you an idea. If you were to go out today, if you went to Elk City Airport, you got on an airplane, you flew directly from there, okay? You flew in a straight line from there to Seattle, Washington. That is 1,436 miles. If you go a little bit further north, a little bit further west, and go to Vancouver Island, you hit about 1,509 miles. That's just one side of the city of the New Jerusalem. Okay? So it's that wide, it's that deep, and then it's that tall. And now here, try to fathom this just a second. We see these pictures from space. They're taken by the International Space Station, right? And everything looks so damn, Do you realize the International Space Station orbits the Earth at only 254 miles? Which means that the walls of the New Jerusalem will tower more than 1,200 miles above where the space station is right now. I don't know about you. I get goosebumps. I start thinking about it. I mean, it's beyond anything that we have imagined. Okay? And then he goes on and says that he measured the wall. Okay? The wall was 144 cubits thick by man's measurement. a cubit was elbow to tip of your finger. Basically, 18 inches is what it is. At 144 cubits, the walls are over 200 feet thick. Okay? Now, once again, we kind of have a hard time thinking this. Imagine when you're on a football field, they kick off from the 30-yard line, and he kicks it and it lands on the goal line. That's 70 yards. That's 210 feet. I mean, that's the thickness of the walls. So it's 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles deep, 1,500 miles tall, and the walls are 70 yards, 200 plus feet thick. And then I just want to read this, beginning in verse 18, because then he describes, says, the wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. Some of those stones we don't even know what they are. But suffice it to say that I think that they are the most beautiful and valuable in all of creation. 12 foundations underneath these walls. Then verse 21, it says the 12 gates were 12 pearls. There's 3 gates on each side. Okay? So 12 gates, each made of a single pearl. Now think about this for a second. This is a wall that is 200 feet thick. The wall is 1,500 miles high, so we're assuming that the gates are good sized. There's 3 of them on each side, and each one of them is made from a single pearl. Single pearl. The great street of the city was of pure gold, like transparent glass. Yeah, I think my thing is we often marvel. We talk about the Garden of Eden and what it must have been like. And my point is that as amazing as the Garden of Eden must have been, I think that it pales in comparison to what God has in store. And we're just talking about the new Jerusalem at this point. We're not even into the new heaven and the new earth. I mean, he's sitting there talking about how, sit and think about it. I'm serious. Just take some time this afternoon, close your eyes, and try to imagine it. And it'll boggle your brain as you try to. But understand this, it's not just new heaven, it's not just new earth, it's not just new Jerusalem. The Bible tells us that we will be given resurrected bodies as well. And so now at salvation, our souls are reborn and are regenerated. But at the resurrection, we will be giving new glorified bodies. And Philippians 3:21 tells us that, isn't it 3:21? Yeah. Says that our bodies will be like Jesus' resurrection body. Now, the reason that's important is that's the same body that he was walking around. He ate in it. He touched people with it. But he also walked through walls and appeared and showed up somewhere else. And I'm like, it's kind of cool. And I don't know everything that it's going to be, but it does say that our bodies will be like his. I think it is safe to say that, and there will be, I do believe with all of my heart that the Bible is very clear, especially as we talk at these reference points. There will be continuation from this life. We'll see things that will be much the same. Whether we look exactly alike, I don't know. But there will be some things, okay? Obviously, the city would not be described the way that it was if everything was going to look completely different, okay? So there are reference points. But our new bodies will be perfectly suited to everything that God has in store for us for all of eternity, to give us the maximum amount of pleasure and of satisfaction and joy, everything perfect for what we need for all of eternity. So, we know what's there, or we know what it is. I want to go back to this Marco Polo illustration and just kind of look at some of the reference points. We ask what isn't going to be there. Verse 4 says this. It says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. You know, when I was growing up, I kind of thought that meant that I could do all of the cool, bike tricks that I always wanted to do. And even when I fell off, I'd never get a skinned knee. I'd never break a bone. It'd be amazing. The implications go so far beyond that. Do you realize this means there will be no anxiety, there will be no jealousy, there will be no frustration, there will be no depression. There's not going to be any unemployment lines, there's not going to be any protests, there's not going to be any police force, there's not going to be any fire department, there's not going to be any psychiatrists, counselors, doctors, lawyers. Won't be a need for them at all. There's not going to be any FBI, CIA, NSA, IRS, none of it, okay? Not going to be, there will be none of that. There's not going to be any divorce, there's not going to be any division, there's not going to be any the frustration, the anger, all of that stuff will be gone. There's not going to be no COVID-19, no quarantine, no cancer, no blood disorders, no heart disease, none of that whatsoever. I mean, think about it. All of that, all of this stuff, there's not going to be any depression. There's not going to be any frustration. There's not going to be any anger. There's not, all of that. All of the things that, I mean, just like the quote said, or just like the clip said, we tend to think of our reality in terms of the suffering and the misery that we go through. Do you realize all of that's going to be gone? Gone. I think one of the most amazing things about heaven sometimes is the fact of what won't be there. What won't be there. There's some other things that won't be there. One of them that I noticed, did you notice in verse 1 it said there was no longer any sea? Today, seas do what? And they're fun to go to the beach, but seas divide us. Seas create borders. Seas create boundaries. They separate continents and people. And what the Bible says that there will no longer be any sea. There will be no separation. The world will be, all of its diversity. You're going to have every tribe, every tongue, every nation joined together as one. But no longer will there be any fences. No longer will there be any borders or none of that. Okay? I mean, there will be no division. There will be no prejudice. There will be no racism. We will once again be what God created us to be. And that is one race, the human race, made in the image of God for the glory of God. That's what we will be. It says there will be no temple. Verse 22 says, I did not see a temple in the city because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. It's not there because we don't need them anymore. No longer do we have to chase after God. No longer do we have to go someplace so that we can do it. We can enter into His presence. Why? Because we will be in His presence at all times. I mean, the Bible is real clear about the fact, we've talked about this. When Jesus died on the cross, He died, and in that moment, the veil was torn in two from top to bottom in the temple. And what did that separate? I mean, what did that symbolize? It symbolized the fact that no longer did sin separate us from God. But see, what's changed now is that we've even gone the step further. Because now what we know is that there will never ever be a nanosecond that we are not in the presence of God, that we are not right there with Him. Goes on talking about the city. Number one, it says there will be no need for a sun or a moon. Why? Because the glory of the Lord will light up the city of Jerusalem. We also know that even though there are 12 gates, they will never be closed. You know when the gates were closed at the temple? At night. Never again will there be night. Okay? Which means, once again, there will never be a time that we are separated from the presence of God. Never again. There will be no curse. In the Garden of Eden, everything was perfect. Work was meaningful. Childbirth wasn't painful. There were no weeds. There was no sweat. There was none of that stuff. And the curse changed all that. The curse ushered in all of this stuff that we struggle with today. The sweat of our brow and painful childbirth and thorns and thistles and just everything that comes with it. In the new heaven, in the new earth, there will be none of the lingering effects of the curse at all, because it will not be there. No longer will creation be frustrated by the curse. Instead, creation will bloom and will flourish. You know, we talk about the city and how amazing it is and everything. I mean, can you imagine creation that is no longer frustrated or stopped, but instead we're talking 1,000 or 10,000 times magnified over what we see today. And we, you look around today and a lot of beautiful things about our world. One of the other things that I think is big is that because of the curse, there was conflict and division that came in between man and woman. There was competition. There was strife that was there. That will be gone. No longer, with the curse gone, there will no longer be any sexism. There will never be any, inequality in the workplace. There won't be no abuse, mental, physical, emotional. Never again will there be any of that, because man and woman will go back to where they were in the garden, and that is that they are a complement to each other. Okay? That there is no separation. I mean, the curse ushered that in, and now it's gone. There's no competition, no comparison, none of that. I think all of it can be summed up really in one thing: the fact that nothing impure will exist in heaven. Nothing. Our spirits, we talked about this. Our spirits are reborn at salvation, but one thing that's not regenerated at salvation is what? Our bodies. That's why we've said before, that there are times, even after you're a Christian, the phone rings and your body still wants to answer it. See, that'll never happen in heaven, because for the first time, there's no phones. For the first time in our existence, think about this. For the first time in our existence, the impulses and desires of our body will be in complete alignment with the will of God. All of the desires and the impulses of our body will be in perfect alignment with our saved souls. For the first time in our existence. I mean, not to mention the fact that, and even beyond that, but all of the things that caused us to sin. Nothing impure, no devil, none of his minions. There's not going to be any lewd advertisements, seductive commercials. You're not going to have road rage. No Las Vegas. But I mean, there will be none of that. And so not only will our impulses we'll have a completely renewed and regenerated body. We'll have that new spirit that we've had since the day that we accepted Christ. And now, in addition, our minds will be completely transformed and renewed. Nothing impure will exist in the kingdom of heaven. I think, I get thinking too, there will be no time. No time clocks, no deadlines, no due dates, no traffic jams, no rain delays at ball games, just no time. We'll be able to go back to prioritizing people over projects and the things that we do. We won't be in a hurry and in a rush to get everywhere, because there will be no time. So what will be there? It's cool to think about what won't be, but what will be there. Number one, unimaginable wealth. I read something the other day. There was a story about a guy that he was really upset, very grieved. He was a Christian, but he felt like he had worked so long and so hard to develop wealth that he'd given to the church and everything else, and it really grieved him that he didn't get to at least take some of it, to kind of show what he'd done. So he made a deal with God, and God said, okay, you can bring one bag with you. I'll allow you to do that. So the guy, he got a trunk, and he had it loaded down with gold bars, and he left word that when he died, that was to be buried with him so that he would be able to take it with him. And the day came, and he died, and he shows up at the pearly gates, and Peter says, sorry, no carry-on baggage. Nothing comes in. And he said, well, no, I had a deal with God. We talked about it, and so there was some checking and verification. He says, okay. Okay, you're right. You get to bring the trunk in. But Peter says, hey, but I got to know what was so important that you made this deal, with God. And so the guy, he opens up the trunk, and he lets Peter look at it. And Peter kind of looks in the trunk, and he looks at the guy, and he just starts laughing. You brought pavement? Seriously, think about it. Heaven is a place where the things that are the most valuable to us are just construction materials in heaven. I mean, the wealth, unimaginable. Like I said, and then creation as well. Everything. No longer frustrated by the curse. The sun, the moon, the stars, everything we see, the universe that I think we're going to be able to travel to and travel around. Creation, everything on steroids multiplied 1,000, 10,000 times is all going to be there. But that shouldn't be the reason we want to be there. Friends and family, those that we love, that have accepted Christ, that went before, it's going to be a reunion like nothing we've ever seen. Amazing time. I was thinking about the saints of old. Man, you realize Adam and Abraham and Moses and Noah and David and Samuel, Levi too. But Gideon and Paul, Peter, Esther, Mary. Yeah, can you imagine sitting around the campfire at night listening to their stories? Whew. What a time. But that shouldn't be the reason that we want to be there either. The reason we want to be there is because he's there. Because Jesus is there. That's the reason that we want to be there. I don't know if you guys, have you ever seen this painting? It's called First Day in Heaven. And I can't tell you the first time I saw it, but it just overwhelms me to think about it, of what that day will be like when I see Jesus face to face. The song, I Can Only Imagine, just kind of, it's one of those that it always, because I don't know what I'm going to do. That's all I can do. I can only imagine what is going to happen. Am I going to rush into his arms, or am I going to fall flat on my face at his feet? Am I going to stand there? Am I going to dance for joy that I made it, or am I going to sit there with my mouth hanging open, just, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. Am I going to sit there and cry tears of joy, or am I going to be overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy? I don't know. There are so many things that I don't know about that day. The only thing I do know is he will be there. Whew! That's why we want to be there. That's why we want to be there. Which I think brings us then to the question of, we know what it's like, we know what's not there, we know what is there. And I think it brings us to that all-important question of what difference does it make to us today? How can embracing the reality of heaven make a difference today? And it's just like I said early on, and this is really the point that I want you to take home from this, and that is that when we begin to see the world, to look at the world around us from the perspective of heaven, we make this world a better place. We will make it into a better place. The problem is that when we begin to see heaven from a worldly perspective, then we make heaven into less than what it is. The old saying is that you can be so heavenly minded you're of no earthly good, and being so earthly minded you're of no heavenly good. No, the fact is that we need to view our existence in light of heaven. See, the thing is, when I realize that I'm going to walk in and I'm going to see Jesus, I'm going to be there, the thing I know is that everything I've ever gone through in my life, everything that I have ever faced in this reality was all worth it. Every bit of it was worth it. And it will all pale in comparison to the first hour that I spend in heaven, let alone the first year, the first millennia. It's going to go on for all of eternity. The thing is that the reason I think that we need to embrace heaven is because we need to understand that when we live in light of and when we live in the shadow of heaven, it changes the way that we live today. It focuses us on the only thing that does matter, and that's eternity. I think we lose sight of that so many times. We think of heaven as a place we get to go, and then we don't even think beyond that. But the fact is that when we view this existence, this temporary life, in the shadow of eternity, we understand the difference that's going on here. Okay, this life is temporary. This life is but a vapor, and it will be gone. But here's the thing. Here's the question I want you to answer as we get ready for our time of decision. Do you realize that every decision you make, every relationship that you foster, and every message that you proclaim in this temporary life will echo for all of eternity? The fact is that if heaven is real, so is hell. And we believe that everybody spends eternity somewhere. And I know that this is, that's where somebody always says, yeah, well, that's the problem I have with God, is God can't believe in a God, I can't love a God that would send people to hell. Okay, you know what? God doesn't send people to hell. Who you choose to follow in this life is who you will follow into the next life. Can't say it any clearer. Who you choose to follow in this life is who you will follow into the next life. It's not about God sending you anywhere. It's about the decisions and the choices that we make. And how can we not love a God who provides heaven to us? Who provides eternal life and the forgiveness of our sins, who paid for it through his Son's life. He offers that to us. Now, I'm going to ask you to stand. And Jesus says 3 times in those last 2 chapters of Revelation, he says, behold, I am coming soon. And what I want you to think about and what I want you to comprehend for just a minute is, number one, heaven is better than we could ever imagine, but it's also sooner than I think we could ever imagine. Jesus says time and time again to be ready. Be ready, be prepared. And the question that we have to answer is today that in light of heaven, in light of the fact that we will live for all of eternity somewhere, and he says he is returning soon, are you ready? If you're not, I challenge you to get ready today. Maybe you need somebody to pray with you, to pray for you. You're struggling with it. I'm going to ask a couple of our elders and their wives to step into our prayer rooms. And if you need somebody to pray with you, pray for you, please just step in there. Maybe you have a decision to make. If you do, I invite you to make it today.